Hello everyone and welcome to this series of videos which set out to cover the grammar contents of Unit 14, Relative Clauses. So without further ado, we're going to start. Well, as you can see, this presentation offers a block of contents. In this first video, we will cover the three first subsections: relative pronouns, defining relative clauses, and non-relative clauses. So in the second video, in turn, we will cover relative adverbs and phrases, prepositions, and also we'll give you a quick tour of the rest of the subsections and the materials that you have at your disposal. We're going to start with relative pronouns. This is a grammar item, a content that we've known for a long time, clauses and relative pronouns, which are that, which, who, whom, and whose. Maybe the most difficult one is whom, but don't worry, I have included some materials within the presentation that will help you understand how to use the pronoun properly. So before we start, we're going to cover the basic structure of a sentence with a relative clause in it. As you can see, this is a sentence that has two parts. The highlighted part is the relative clause, and the rest of the sentence would be the main clause. So we would say the old photograph that you can see ahead of you shows Marconi at Single Hill. Another example, the story of radio probably begins with Heinrich Hertz, who was the first to produce radio waves in a laboratory. So as you can see, the second part of this sentence would be the relative clause, the highlighted part, and the rest would be the main clause, la oración principal. All right? Now, the invention which made this possible was the World Wide Web. All right? So in this case, again, the relative clause, and the rest will be the main clause. So that's the basic structure of a sentence with a relative clause in it. I want to say something in relation to the usage of certain pronouns. We know that the pronoun who is for people and which for objects. And we also know that the relative pronoun, that can play the part of both which and who. If we use that in a sentence, that makes it sound more informal. So we could say, the invention that made this possible was the vacuum tube. But in the same sentence, if instead of using the relative pronoun that, we would use which, we would sound more polite, okay, more formal. So the invention which made this possible was the vacuum tube. So there's, as you can see, a difference in register when it comes to using one relative pronoun over the other. All right? Okay, and as I promised, here in this section, you will find a video which very clearly explains the difference between, how to use whom, and difference between whom and other relative pronouns such as who and whose. Okay? Watch the video, and if you have any doubts whatsoever, don't hesitate to jot them down and ask me in our online lesson. Okay, we're going to move back to the block of contents. We're going to cover defining relative clauses now. Well, when we use a relative clause within a sentence, it may well be because we need to explain what a noun or a noun phrase is, right? We need that particular relative clause to make sense of a part of the sentence. For example, as of yet, not one of the people who actually committed these offenses has served time. All right? So, in this case, I need the relative clause to make sense of the main clause. As you can see, if we dropped the relative clause, the main sentence would make no sense whatsoever. As of yet, not one of the people has served time. It's very vague. I really need a relative sentence to make sense to make more sense, right? I need a relative sentence in this particular case to specify which type of person or thing I mean. All right? And as you can see, we don't use any commas. All right? That's regarding defining relative clauses. Let's move on to non-defining relative clauses now. Well, in this case, with non-defining relative clauses, what happens is that I introduce in the sentence, in the main sentence, a relative clause because I want to add extra information or information that is interesting to and regarding, a part of the sentence that I've already mentioned, and I want to add more information, but it is not needed to make sense of the sentence, right? So let's have a look at some examples here. Marconi's wireless telegraph, which he set up in England, employed around 50 people. Now, in this particular case, I'm including a relative clause because I want to add this extra piece of information about the wireless telegraph, which he set up in England. But if I drop to the entire relative clause in the main clause, only the main clause would make total sense. Marconi's wireless telegraph employed around 50 people. So this is just extra information. All right? The same thing goes in this case. Auguste Righet, who Marconi respected greatly, guided his research. So in this case, I'm just adding extra information that we don't need to make sentence of the main clause. All right? Well, and apart from this, I would like to mention something about the relative pronoun that in non-defining relative clauses. Now, normally we use the pronouns which and who, but unlike in the case of defining relative clauses, I can't or I shouldn't use the relative pronoun that instead of who or which. Now, as I point out here, some people might use it, you might hear it, but it is grammatically incorrect. So especially when you're writing, avoid using the relative pronoun that in a non-defining relative clause, okay? So remember that would be grammatically incorrect. Okay? And in terms of formation, as I told you before, as this non-defining relative clause appears in the main sentence between commas because, as I've said before, it's extra piece of information. I mean, it's a piece of information that we don't need to make sense of the whole sentence. So 4 people were given jail sentences, 2 of which were leavened following the banker's failed appeal. Well, as you can see, 2 of which is not really a relative pronoun, is a relative phrase, right? But we don't have to use relative pronouns necessarily or not only, okay? This is something that we cover in the second video, right? Relative sentences can be introduced either by a relative pronoun, as we have seen in this first part of the video, or by relative adverbs or phrases, okay? And the second example, Auguste Righet, whom Marconi respected greatly, guided his research. Now, when you watch the video on whom, you will see that whom is more formal than who. We could have easily said who in this case. Auguste Righet, whom Marconi respected greatly, guided his research. But whom is more formal, okay? There's some other differences that you will learn in the video that I posted, okay? All right. So that's all for the first video. I hope you understood the explanation, and I hope I was clear enough. If I didn't, jot down your doubts and we will cover them in our online lessons. In the second part of the video, we will cover the rest of the contents of the presentation. Okay? All right. Bye-bye.